All right, this is going to be a video on the posterior analytics, and it's going to, or I'm going to attempt in this video, it'll probably take more than one video, to sort of wrap up the puzzle. So I've had a bunch of videos in the first part of the book, going through chapter by chapter, describing the arguments Aristotle's making there. And I keep referring, or I've referred several times anyway, to the solution, which only comes in the final chapter of the book. And I'm not going to do the rest of the book in order, partly because there's no reason to sort of suffer through all of the chapters from this point on in order until you get to the solution. Instead, I'm going to give you the solution. I'm going to explain the other things he says in light of what that solution seems to be. But I want to remind you first of what the problem or the issue. So recall the very first line of the book. All instruction, given or received by way of argument, proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. This sounds like Plato. Remember, Plato in the Meno said that, well, the solution to the problem of how we come to have knowledge of concepts is that we're born with information or true opinions already in our soul. So they can sound kind of similar. Plato doesn't say we have innate knowledge, but he does say we have innate true opinion. Aristotle here seems to be saying all instruction by way of argument, another way of translating that is all learning, requires pre-existent knowledge. That sounds like he's even going stronger than Plato. It sounds like he's saying we have innate knowledge, but knowledge we were born with, but he's not saying it. What Aristotle's saying is that every proof, this is what I said in the very first video on this book, every proof requires pre-existent knowledge. Every demonstration requires pre-existent knowledge. Why? Because you have to know the fundamental premises of the demonstration. The foundational premises, right? The things that have to be there because of that regress argument, that argument that said demonstration can't go on backwards forever, can't go in a circle, right? So there have to be some first terms or first principles that we base everything we know on. What makes them first principles is that they aren't demonstrated. We lack a proof of them. But nonetheless, they have to be known. So they have to be known by some way other than proof. Now, if what Aristotle were to say here was that, well, we've known them since birth, we were born knowing them, or to go closer to Plato, we were born having true opinions about them, his position would basically just be Plato's. This would basically just be a rehashing of Meno's paradox, although in a more formal and I think better argued version. Like the regress argument and Meno's paradox have some similar things in common. Or some things in common, but Aristotle's argument is, I think, a lot more straightforward. But his position wouldn't be interesting if he just said, well, we're born knowing the first principles. But that's not what he says. He makes clear he doesn't want to go the way Plato does. In the reading, he says, if this distinction, and as I explained, that distinction is between the particular and the universal is not drawn, we are faced with the dilemma in the Meno. Either a man will learn nothing or what he already knows, for we cannot accept the solution which some people offer. The some people there is Plato. Plato's solution is the one that Aristotle is just out on. Why is he out on it? Well, some reason is that he just doesn't think it's plausible that people are born with the true opinions. Another reason is that saying we were born with the true opinions required Plato to say we're caused to have those true opinions by something. What were we caused to have them by? We were caused to have them by the forms. So for every definition, there is a corresponding form. Right? And Aristotle doesn't believe in Plato's forms. He believes in a thing called forms. We're not going to talk about it. It's found in other works of Aristotle's, but he doesn't believe in Plato's forms. And that was part of Plato's explanation for how innate true opinion was possible. So Aristotle's going to take a different approach. And the different approach is that he's going to say there's a way of knowing other than proof, other than demonstration. This is what Plato basically refused to go along with. But what is this other way of knowing? Well, to see that, we're going to need to go to the final chapter of the book. Okay, so Aristotle's ruled out innate knowledge. And he's ruled out the idea that everything can get demonstrated. And so he says, therefore, we must possess a capacity of some sort, but not such as to rank higher in accuracy than these developed states. The developed states are the things you get from demonstration. And also, importantly, I'll get back to this in a minute. Also, knowledge of the first principles of demonstration. So we have to have some capacity that gives us knowledge, but not knowledge so good as our knowledge of the first principles. Now, you might be wondering, like, well, wasn't this all about how we get knowledge of the first principles? Yes, but there's going to be a kind of two-stage process. The first stage is with a capacity that Aristotle says we share with animals. He says, and this at least is an obvious characteristic of all animals, for they all possess a congenital discriminative capacity, which is called sense perception. So, and I'll summarize what goes on to the next few paragraphs. Here's what he's saying. The way we get knowledge of first principles starts with perception. Right? It starts with sense perception. We see, we hear, we taste, we smell, we touch. These are the five senses that Aristotle typically identifies. And it's how the information gets in us. Right? Now, Plato would have had none of this. Plato would have said, you can't base your knowledge of universal truths on perception. Why? Well, one problem, and this is a problem that concerns Aristotle most, is that perception is always of particular things. That's why he says back in, I believe, chapter 31, perception can't give us scientific knowledge. Right? So if you go back to 31, one of the chapters I assigned of book 1, and this chapter here, chapter 19 of book 2, it can seem like their intention, because chapter 31 says scientific knowledge cannot come from perception. You can't use perception to get scientific knowledge or understanding. Right? So perception by itself cannot get you to knowledge of first principles. But here he's saying we need to have a capacity that explains how we know first principles, and it's sense perception. And the answer to the question how he can maintain both of these things is that there's a process, a stage. And the beginning stage is perception. Now, perception is always of particular things. Right? Whenever you perceive something, you're perceiving some particular thing or some particular set of things. Right? You'd be perceiving many things at once. Like I have on my desk right now 7 soda cans. Right? I'm perceiving 7 particular things, but everything I perceive is a particular thing. I can't perceive a universal. That's not what our senses do. Our senses tell us about physical things, and every physical thing is, well, a particular thing. But this, Aristotle thinks, is how the process begins. Now, every animal can perceive. That's what's the defining trait of animals, according to Aristotle. What separates animals from plants is perception, according to Aristotle. Some animals, the ones that Aristotle would say don't have any understanding of time, they just perceive moment to moment and they don't remember anything. And so they similarly never come to anticipate anything. But some animals can remember. And we are among the animals who can remember. So we can go to the board a little bit. Blackboard, just moved a word, I didn't mean to. Here we go. So we can distinguish different kinds of animals. Right? So we have the class of all animals or perceivers. And of course, different animals perceive things different ways. But that doesn't matter. Aristotle's not going to privilege one kind of, I'm going to write perceivers, look better here, one kind of perception as the only one that gets us knowledge. And then on the other side, you've got non-perceivers, right, or plants. So perceivers, animals. Among animals, there are some that have memory. So we'll say those with memory. And we're among that group. The animals that don't have memory, I'm not entirely sure what Aristotle has in mind. There's a famous, well, I think it's famous. Anyway, there's a great song lyric. How about, let's say that, from Ani DiFranco. They say goldfish have no memory. Right? That's not the whole lyric. It's a great lyric when you listen to it. Just go, it's called Little Plastic Castle. Go listen to the song Little Plastic Castle. It's a great song. Anyway, goldfish, maybe they don't have memory, but us and like elephants and, you know, dogs and cats, most animals do, right? Pretty much any animal you could train would have memory. But that's not enough. So here's what Aristotle thinks. Animals can perceive particular things. It's what we do. Some among those animals can remember the particular things they perceived. But that by itself is not enough. There's another stage. And for this, he uses a very unfortunate term. He uses the term experience. So here's what Aristotle's thinking. There's some subcategory of animals who are not only able to remember what they perceive, they're also able to form experiences out of those memories. Now, you might think we have an experience every time we perceive something, and I think that's very much in keeping with the way we use the word now. And so it's good not to think or focus too much on the particular English word used to translate the particular Greek word that Aristotle's using. I'll try to explain it in a different way. So let's say, right, you have seen a lot of, let's do giraffes, because giraffes are easy to draw because they got long necks, so you always know it's a giraffe. Right? Also, there's this podcast where the philosophy podcast where the podcaster is always using giraffes as an example. So here, I'm drawing 3 giraffes. Very badly. They got little tails and smiles. There they're giraffes. So every animal is capable of perceiving giraffes in some way or other. Right? Some animals will get most of their information through sight. Some animals will get most of their information through sound. Some through smell, you know, potentially. Maybe there's animals who only get it through taste or touch, but that'd be weird. Anyway, here we've got 3 giraffes. Every animal can perceive them. Some animals can remember them, so they can remember the giraffes they've perceived. To form an experience seems to be doing the following thing. Not just remembering each giraffe, right? So let's say we'll draw an animal here looking at the giraffe. Right? This animal will be a person. Right? Every animal can perceive. Some animals can remember. So let's say, like in their head now, are 3 giraffes. To form an experience, though, is not just to have these 3 giraffes in your memory. It's to do the following thing. It's to recognize them as all being of a kind. To sort of categorize them together, to recognize them as objects that are relevantly similar to each other. And implicitly what that's going to mean is also not grouping with them things that don't belong with them. So not only can we perceive particular things, not only can we keep a record of those perceptions, we can also bind those memories together. And what you've done by the time you've done this is you have a concept, right? Someone, whoops, or any creature which has, and for some reason this has all stopped working. There we go. A creature who has seen the giraffes, remembered the giraffes, and then categorized the giraffes together has effectively just gotten the concept of a giraffe. They now have the idea. Now that last step is going to be for Plato like the whoa, 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 stop right there. How did you go from remembering a bunch of giraffes to grouping them all together correctly? Because what Plato and Aristotle are both going to say is there's correct and incorrect ways to group everything. Right? This is just the way of saying there are real concepts and then there are fake concepts. There are concepts that aren't accurate. So for example, you could, if you wanted, right, have a concept that had giraffes, but also zebras. Right? And here's make them a zebra. Right? This looks obviously very much like a zebra. You could have a concept that grouped them together. That would be a bad concept. Right? There'd be a concept that doesn't correspond to anything real. So at this point, Plato would say, like, well, if our concepts are going to be the right concepts, they need to be the right concepts because otherwise you're not going to be able to get genuine understanding of the world. So for example, if you grouped things together if you grouped animals together by what they look like on the outside, you'd put whales in the fish category. And then if you were trying to come up with, for example, an evolutionary history of the various species, right, and phylum and all that stuff, you keep running into problems because you keep trying to find a way that fish and whales are all closely related when they're just not, right? So if you get the wrong concepts, you're not going to be able to understand the world. And Plato is going to jump in and say, no, that last step where you group things together, how are you doing it correctly? Right? Now, this Aristotle doesn't, in this book, seem to have much of an answer for. I'll get in a minute to something that seems to provide something of an answer, but we'll see how good it is. But appreciate the problem, right? Nothing that Aristotle said so far is something that Plato wouldn't have been aware of as an option. But it's that last stage, the stage of experience, right? The stage of, I guess I should have made this blue to correspond, the stage of grouping everything together properly, that is going to allow knowledge of universal claims. Because once you have the concept of giraffe, then you can start saying things like, all giraffes are quadrupeds. And that can be true or false. In this case, I guess technically false. You can have three-legged giraffes. But what Aristotle would say is like somehow the three-legged giraffes are deficient giraffes or only partially giraffes or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what he'd say about that case. But at the very least, this is a universal claim. It's that last step of grouping things together that we can do, that lots of other animals can't, that allows us to not know universal claims, but to have them. This is where we get them. Right? Concepts are in their nature universal, and we can get concepts, Aristotle thinks, by repeated perception, memorizing, and then a kind of cognitive sorting process. So he's got a story about how we get concepts that's different than Plato's. Plato thinks we're born with the concepts. We're born further with true opinions about the concepts. Aristotle thinks we start out without the concepts and we slowly generate them over time. And this explains why little kids don't seem to have any of the relevant concepts, why it takes time to acquire them, which is exactly Aristotle's problem with Plato's answer. It takes time because you have to perceive things a lot over and over and over again, he says. You have to remember them. So when you're young and your memory's not too good, you can't make any real progress. And then you have to go through the process of figuring out which things are like which things. Now, for most of us, that last process has helped along by the fact that people are telling us what the categories are. But sometimes those are wrong. Right? Sometimes we figure out on our own that maybe the concepts that people told us were important actually aren't important. I'll use an example from my own life, right? So I'm very interested in politics, always have been since I was a little kid. Used to talk to my dad about politics a lot. And for my dad, the key issue in politics was big government versus small government. You could sort and categorize every politician and every policy and everything about whether it was supportive of big government or small government. And big government was bad and small government was good. So that was a category I was taught. That was a concept I was taught. Right? The idea was you can categorize politicians, policies, you can categorize ideologies by this, in this way, by separating the big government, politicians, policies, and ideologies from the small government, politicians, policies, and ideologies. And then over time, I came to realize this is just a really terrible way of trying to understand politics. This is an attempt to reduce politics to a single issue that honestly just isn't important. Whether government is big or small, for one thing, there's no real clear way to measure that. Like different people have different ways of measuring it, so it's not even clear exactly what's meant. But also, just like no important issue actually turns on this, right? Everybody agrees sometimes government should be bigger and sometimes smaller. It's not really a genuine core commitment of anyone's, big government or small government. People like to say that they're in favor of small government, but they're always in favor of it until the moment when an emergency arises and all of a sudden big government is what's necessary. I'm recording this right now during the coronavirus scare when everybody seems to be in favor of gigantic, massive government. So what I came to decide was this way of categorizing things politically was just useless, and I needed to get a different set of concepts. What Aristotle thinks is this takes time. And it takes different amounts of time for different subjects. So we haven't read it in this class, but there's a book called The Nicomachean Ethics. I can show it to you. Because I'm also recording videos about this book, where he says that when it comes to ethics, you've got to wait till you're like full grown before you can do anything. He says young men shouldn't be students of ethics. They shouldn't like go to philosophy lectures about ethics, which is always a delicate point I reach when I teach ethics to college students. It takes time to acquire these concepts because this is a process that requires repeated attempts. He compares it to an orderly retreat in battle, where you fall back and then one line of soldiers stops and holds their ground, so another line of soldiers can get behind them, stop and hold their ground, and only after this is done a bunch of times, like, can the line reform. So Aristotle thinks that by repeated perception, memorization, and sort of cognitive sorting, we can come to have all our concepts. We can come to be able to understand in a way universals, but he doesn't think this gets us all the way to knowledge. This process, by the way, this will be an important term, this process of perception, memory, and then the creation of experience is, when translated into English, induction. In Greek, it's epigoge. I'm going to bring up the induction as a translation of epigoge issue much later in the course when we get to Hume, because I'll be pointing out that Hume means a different thing, or not exactly the same thing by induction as Aristotle does by the word we translate as induction. But for now, it's induction. Induction is a different kind of logic than deduction. Here, I should stop using colors that correspond to what we're doing here. I'll use green. No, I've used green. Here, I'll just use white. So we have induction and we have deduction. When I did that video on Aristotle's logic, that was all deduction. Induction is a different kind of reasoning. Deduction goes from universal claims to either other universal claims or to particular claims. Right? So you have universal premises, and you go down to either other universal premises or you start with universal premises and you go to either universal conclusions or particular conclusions. Right? In deduction, you can't ever go from particular to universal. It just doesn't work. Induction is exactly the kind of reasoning that does that. Induction is the process by which we start from perceptions of particular things and we come, as a conclusion, to universal claims. And the problem here is that Aristotle thinks we need something besides induction. We do need induction because the only way for the information, for the raw data to get in your mind is through perception. And you need some way to get from perception of particular things to beliefs in universal propositions. That's the process of induction. But in order to have genuine knowledge, in order to have episteme of something like this, induction's not going to be enough. Why? Well, let's go back to the text. All right, this video is already getting a little long, so I'm actually going to cut it here, and the remainder of this topic is going to be covered in a subsequent video.